person. I am Marcy Shore. I'm a historian here at Yale, and it is a great pleasure to welcome Professor Albena Azmanova. I wish we could be welcoming her in real life, but given the current dystopian state of the plague, we are welcoming her on Zoom as we do these days. She is zooming in from Bulgaria. I met Professor Azmanova during this plague in person in Vienna last year when we were both at the Institute for Human Sciences there. She is a political philosopher. And really from after our first conversation, I thought I have to introduce my graduate students to her because she is exactly the kind of mind and personality that they need, perhaps especially at this moment when everyone is getting very depressed. Professor Azmanova is both learned and irreverent. She is quite fresh, spontaneous, original, sharp, entertaining, and penetrating, and will hopefully liven up our day here, and a wonderful voice for an apocalyptic moment when people are falling into a depression. She is originally from Bulgaria, where she is currently zooming in to us. She had a political coming of age in the 1980s when she was very young as a participant in the dissident movements that eventually succeeded in overthrowing communism, as you all know, in 1989. She studied in Bulgaria, in the United States, in France for the past quarter century. She has been a professor in Brussels, a professor of political and social theory at the University of Kent's Brussels School of International Studies. Her 2012 book is called The Scandal of Reason, A Critical Theory of Political Judgment. And her most recent book, which she's going to talk about today, which has a fantastic cover, so I encourage you all to look for it, Capitalism on Edge, How Fighting Precarity Can Achieve Radical Change Without Crisis or Utopia. And she shifts in this book a lens from inequality to precarity, which is a word that I've started to use as if it were just like a regular word I had my whole life, ever since I started reading Albena's work. And it suggests, or it argues, that at a certain point, neoliberalism surreptitiously mutated into what Professor Azmanova calls precarity capitalism. I think this concept particularly speaks to me because it's about anxiety, which is generally my predominant emotion about the world, but I am not going to say anything else about it. I am going to turn it over to Professor Azmanova, who will talk to you for half an hour or so, and then you have a chance to ask her questions. So thank you for being with us.
Thank you. It's a joy, and what an honor, I mean, to be able to talk about my work in this setting. So let me just confess that this book was set in motion by a sheer stroke of luck. I was asked the right question at the right time. So about a year or 2 years before the 2004 European Parliament elections, a group of left parties at the European Parliament suggested that I investigate for them a development that puzzled and worried them. So back then, Europe was in excellent shape. It was prosperous, was peaceful. This was before the economic crisis of 2008. And yet the ruling left parties across Europe were all being voted out of power. So despite good economic growth and low unemployment. So these left parties were asking me, well, what is going on? I started digging into the issue, and this directed my attention to the rise of far-right anti-establishment movements much before the economic crisis. So after the crisis, these movements were typically discussed and discarded as populist. But at the time, they were labeled anti-establishment insurgencies. And I saw them as a symptom of something rather different. The reshaping of the ideological space of liberal democracies as new broadly shared public concerns with physical, political, economic, and cultural insecurity were cutting across the left-right ideological positions. Now, since then, two phenomena have grabbed academic and policy attention. One is the rise of autocratic rule, like unaccountable rule in liberal democracies, which has been, very sharply felt during the healthcare crisis of the coronavirus pandemic, the current pandemic. The second phenomenon is the rise of inequalities, which started to be discussed as the key social injustice of our times after the economic crisis of 2008. So the typical interpretation goes something like this. The rising inequalities have caused the impoverishment and the anger of many who have turned against the ruling elites of the center left and center right. Well, my interpretation is different. I will not tell you exactly why I'm not buying this version, but I give a different interpretation. And what helps me to see the whole matter differently is first that my attention was directed to these developments, as I said, rather early. So before the financial crisis, thus explanations of impoverishment do not quite work. But also, I admit that I'm helped by an element of my personal biography that Marcy mentioned. I grew up in an egalitarian society under a socialist dictatorship in Bulgaria. So I tend to be skeptical about arguments that economic inequality in itself is a problem and that more equality is a solution. I know how unfashionable that position is, and I'm fully prepared to defend it. So I take not inequality itself, but the concern with inequality, the fact that inequality troubles us as a symptom that something else is going on. So the important question to ask is, when does the statistical fact of economic inequality become a form of social injustice? When does it trigger discontent? These are slightly different questions, but one answer to both would be when wealth becomes the only apparent source of safety, when we have no other stabilization but personal wealth. And this is our predicament now. So I think the real culprit is precarity, which I define, and this is really a word that entered the English language vocabularies, dictionaries, only about 10, 15 years ago, before we would say precariousness. Somebody is precarious. Now precarity is becoming a new word, an official word. So I define it as a condition of politically generated economic insecurity and social vulnerability that harms people's material and psychological welfare, as well as society's capacity to cope with adversity and govern itself. So there is a personal and a societal dimension to this fragility. Now, importantly, this growing insecurity is politically generated. So precarity is different from our frailty as mortal beings, or what the Russian thinker Mikhail Bakhtin has called our cosmic dread, the anxiety we experience in the face of the infinitely enormous and powerful forces beyond human control. Fear that is, according to him, at the very foundation of human experience and thinking. So precarity, how does it emerge? How come it has not always been there? Well, it has been politically engineered as Western governments towards the end of the 20th century put in place a system of globally integrated capitalism within which increased competition for profits has made governments completely abandon societies to market forces. Now, the ensuing precarity has spared almost no one. It has affected not only those on poorly paid and insecure jobs, the so-called precariat, the precarious class about which the wonderful British sociologist Guy Standing talks. But I think it has also affected the highly skilled, well-educated and well-paid professionals. It is spreading to the very top of the social hierarchy. We now hear stories about lawyer burnout and young Goldman Sachs bankers begging for a 20-hour week cap. So this, in my view, is what troubles the 99%. And they're right to worry. The COVID pandemic itself was preceded and enabled by an epidemic of economic precarity that made our affluent, politically sophisticated and scientifically advanced societies unable to cope with a virus that was neither completely unknown nor too deadly. So one other thing to clarify, of course, insecurity is an endemic feature of capitalism. I'm often asked that. Of that process of creative destruction that Karl Marx dissected and Joseph Schumpeter popularized. Yet precarity should not be equated with the instability that the dynamics of modernity exacerbated by capitalism invariably generate. Neither is precarity concomitant with worsening living conditions. Of course, we live in better lives than ever in material terms. So it has nothing to do with the drop in purchasing power or unsanitary environment even, although these are factors. The material conditions in contemporary capitalist democracies, the affluent West, have never been better. But the essence of precarity is disempowerment, not insecurity. So the word precarity has its origin in the Latin precarious, which means obtained by entreaty, by begging or praying. So by something given as a favor, depending on the pleasure or mercy of others. So the core feature of precarity is powerlessness. It literally means depending on the will of another. So this is the worst form of insecurity. Think of it in a way, uncertainty is not a bad thing, is not a problem. We can be uncertain about the future and still be confident that everything is going to be okay, that we will do well. The source of anxiety in states of precarity is the knowledge that we are incapable of coping. So I have started to think about precarity as a condition of disempowerment that haunts individuals and communities in contemporary capitalism, which has resulted from a radical misalignment between two things. On the one hand, responsibility that we accrue and power. So the capacity to cope with that responsibility. This is rooted, for instance, in the tendency of allocating responsibilities to citizens and public institutions for all kinds of things, for keeping ourselves in good health, for safeguarding the environment, for making us employable, employed, etc. So giving us all these responsibilities without equipping us with the financial and institutional resources we need to carry out these responsibilities. So think about hospitals poorly equipped to cope when the coronavirus pandemic first hit. Another source of precarity is a political economy in which we're all increasingly dependent on holding a job as the only source of revenue, but good jobs are increasingly scarce and competition for them is deadly. In the book, I discuss this as one of the two contradictions or antinomies of contemporary capitalism, of precarity capitalism. I call this antinomy acute job dependency. The other is surplus employability. So the tension between, well, the fact that we have this unprecedented capacity, thanks to automation, to produce the necessities of life with very little input of labor, but the increased commodification pressures on everybody to stay employed and to work more and more. So precarity results from this misalignment between responsibility and capacity to cope with that responsibility. Now, responsibility without power, what does it do? It generates anxiety and alienation. This fosters the reactionary attitudes expressed in the electoral support to far-right populist parties. I prefer not to call them populist, but that's another issue. They offer security shortcuts, closing borders, banning immigration, law and order measures. On the other side, power without responsibility that they invite in enables the rise of autocracy, expressed in rule of law backsliding, or that is violations of the rule of law, deliberate violations of the rule of law in even in countries such as France, where the rule of law is well established. I've written about that in a recent report for the European Parliament. I'll probably put the link in the chat later. So precarity and the rise of autocracy are connected. The more vulnerable people feel, the more they are willing to rely on a political strongman to provide instant stability. So this is, the constitution of unfreedom in contemporary liberal societies. Precarity is the source of that tendency. Now, however, autocratic shortcuts to security are very treacherous because they disempower us further. So they stabilize through these shortcuts, but this is a disempowerment. And remember, the essence of precarity is disempowerment. So that we're aggravating the condition of precarity we mean to cure. Then the issue is, how do we get unstuck? Now, the task of getting out of this situation is difficult for two reasons. First, the old social, democratic, and socialist solutions that are becoming fashionable now, or solutions that rely on democratization of the economy, they would not work in the current historical junction. For instance, these models rely on growth and redistribution of that growth or affluence equally. So I call that inclusive affluence. But that is going to be very detrimental to the environment. So that solution would not help us cope with the ecological crisis. The welfare state in capitalist democracies basically, as the socialist states behind the Iron Curtain, they destroyed the environment. So the other reason is the example of China has displayed that the collective ownership of the means of production, be it on the level of the company, right, on the factory, on the company, or on the level of the state, does not prevent that state or that company to behave like a capitalist entity, like a capitalist agent in the global economy, that is, to pursue profit with all the negative impacts this has on individuals, on our communities, and on nature. Now, the second difficulty for getting us unstuck from this situation of precarity is that one of the consequences of precarity is that it makes people conservative, even reactionary, as they're afraid of change, even though change is badly needed. Precarity erodes solidarity, as everyone is out to save their own necks. The middle classes are abandoning the poor, and the working classes are once again turning against immigrants for fear of job loss. Various minorities are competing for victimhood, as this is the only apparent avenue to social protection. We have seen how, these discourses are increasing the intensity recently. So, and maybe the worst impact of economic insecurity is that it is politically debilitating. It directs all our efforts at finding and stabilizing sources of income, leaving neither time nor energy for larger battles about the kind of life we want to live. As one of my critics beautifully put it once, when I was saying, well, we're all precarious, so we should unite in the fight against precarity and basically against global capitalism. And she said, well, these precarious people, they have no time. Try inviting them to dinner, let alone call them on a revolution. So what could we do? Intellectually, we need to escape what I call the paradox of emancipation. So let me explain this a little bit. Currently, struggles for justice are dominated by calls for fighting exclusion and inequality. This is the logic behind calls for radical redistribution from rich to poor, but also against racial, gender, and other forms of exclusion and inequality. But note that such struggles are haunted by a very twisted logic. When we fight for equality and inclusion in an unjust society, we in fact increase the value of that world or of that club in which we're so eager to be included as equals. Take the calls against economic inequality. So appeals to more equality seem very progressive, I admit. They make us feel we are on the right side of history. People say they're a rejection of the logic of savage capitalism that creates all these inequalities. But the departure from the neoliberal convention is only apparent. Thinking in terms of inequality engages a logic of comparison between individuals and presents the idea of social justice in individualistic terms, as a matter of personal circumstances, of private wealth. Such a focus on individual circumstance is a trademark of the neoliberal mentality. What it eliminates, this focus on comparisons between individuals, eliminates the notion of collective well-being, which is actually the essence of socialism. So as critics, as scholars, as thinkers, what we'll help to do is distinguish between the injustice of bad power distribution, so power inequalities on one hand, on the other, the structural mechanisms through which this is achieved, but then also keep in mind that there is a third. There are the broader dynamics of the social system to which we're all subjugated. In terms of capitalism, that is the logic of the pursuit of profit. So in my work, I distinguish between these three dimensions of domination, or three forms of domination. I call them relational, structural, and systemic forms. And I appeal, I actually insist that we call radical. So all of these trajectories of fighting injustice are important, but I call radical only those struggles that are directed at fighting systemic forms of domination and injustice. So to put it briefly, making us all more equal within this deeply unjust world of precarity is better than spreading that injustice unevenly. I admit that. But while we are at it, let us try to do better than this. I think the time is ripe for a more radical, more meaningful change. And we can achieve this change without the help of a terrible crisis, a bloody revolution, or even a glamorous utopia. And in the book, in Capitalism on Edge, I give some ideas on how to do exactly that. This is it.
Oh, thank you so much. Okay, I definitely want to hear some of the ideas about how we're going to save the world. But first, let me let other people ask questions. Christina's going to help me here because my Zoom skills are extremely primitive. So whoever would like to ask a question can raise their hand in that weird electronic way that one can do that on Zoom. And I think Christina will see that hand raised. I'm not sure that I can see it. You can also type questions into the Q&A and I can read them out for you if that is helpful.
So while we're waiting for questions, I'm going to put the link to this report I just completed for the European Parliament I mentioned. Do I put it in the chat or in the Q&A?
Put it in the wait,
in the chat.
In the chat. Okay.
In the chat. Okay. Because there I address specific violations of the rule of law in France, Spain, and Bulgaria, and the way the European Commission actually does not react, so it actually becomes part of the problem. And I link that to issues of precarity. But I cannot put no open question. Only hosts and panelists can see the poll. How do
I can change that. Sorry about that.
I cannot put it, but I can put it in the chat.
Okay, I'm going to read a question from Alexandra Kolodjejska, who is the new generation coming into this world, which is already in a state of catastrophe. So I met her in Poland this summer. She's just about to start university, and we don't want to completely depress her because we are all counting on that generation to save the world. Okay, that's just my little prelude, uninvited, to her question. Okay, so Alexandra's question is, how would this work in a globalizing society? How would this new system benefit both the Western rich countries as well as the poorer nations?
Yeah, great question. So this is the great curse for the left, because international solidarity is completely broken as the Western working classes are struggling for jobs and revenue, with the working classes outside of the West. So indeed, that any left parties who want to preserve, continue calling itself left, needs to solve that predicament. Now, how would it work? So my proposals, where to start, on the level of the global political economy, they concern placing very high demands for labor protection and environmental protection in trade treaties. So no goods that are produced with, rampant exploitation and pollution can be traded. Of course, this will make these products more costly, for everyone. I admit that there is no magical solution, but that is why I'm suggesting that, because what the grievance of people, what worries people is instabilities, precarity, rather than levels of affluence. That the drop in affluence would be compensated by better living and working conditions, better environment, so by stabilization, by less precarity, so less affluent but less precarity. And I believe on that ground, there could be some consensus about the changes that we need to undertake. To the extent that everybody is competing on the lowest price in the world, in the global capitalism, we as consumers, we might continue having cheaper goods, but as workers, everybody loses, and as people who live in these societies, everybody loses. So to swap affluence with precarity and then go ahead with those reforms in international trade would be my suggestion. And the European Commission has, over the past year, in fact, started to draft proposals in that direction. Now, whether this would be implemented remains to be seen, but the European Green Deal addresses exactly those issues on paper so far.
Let me read the next question, which I think is related, from John Anderson. How does precarity fit in the context of American capitalism's inequality and segregation in the 21st century? And what can be done about it in the United States in the wake of the Great Recession and the current recession caused by the global pandemic?
Okay, so if I understand well, the issue is about the relation between precarity and inequality, in fact. Here's what I have to say. Now, the correlation between impoverishment and inequality is not straight. I mean, basic courses in economics admit that. Depends, we need to approach wealth not as something to be distributed, but first to question how it is produced. So if we produce our wealth in a way that it creates more inequality, let's say because it credits effort, education, risk, as in capitalism, very much it's related to how much risk one undertakes as an entrepreneur. Now, there would be some inequality, but that might actually work in the interest of the poorest people. So in relative terms, they would be poorer, but not in absolute terms. As the philosopher Harry Frankfurt has observed, the poor suffer not because others have more, but because they don't have enough. So think about wealth in terms of first wealth creation, and then if you have a bone to pick with that process of wealth creation, do something about that. But it doesn't make sense to start from redistribution without questioning how we produce our wealth, with what consequence, social consequences. And I think there's a lot wrong with the way we produce our wealth that creates precarity as well as inequality and creates impoverishment and terrible pollution. What did I want to say? But the real issue is to see when, in fact, inequality, economic inequality translates into social inequality. And that happens, so that people are unequal in society socially. And that usually has specific mechanisms, institutional mechanisms. Let's take why in America, and certainly not so much in Europe, wealth translates into political influence. This is very much connected with specific mechanisms such as campaign financing. So fix those mechanisms that translate inequality into social injustice and things that we consider unfair. That would be partially my answer to that.
The next question is by Alan Halpern, and it's a two-part question. How does the difference between perceived precarity and actual precarity affect your analysis? Is it perception that matters? And then the other question is related to relative precarity. If I had more control over my life in the past than I do in the present, is that change, is that relative change what makes a difference in my experience and my thinking and my behavior?
Yes. Well, perceptions absolutely matter. Yes. I think that experience of anxiety we have is because these processes have been so intensive over the past 20 years. And generations have seen, have experienced that change. This is not, so the relation between perceived and actual precarity, I have not studied. It needs to be studied. This is something that I hope people do. Also, we need to study, this, and I hope that I would do that next. That link between responsibility and means to carry it out. This is a matter of empirical work that needs to be done. So I welcome the question. I'm aware that I cannot answer it well, but I admit that more work needs to be done. So social psychologists should help us there.
Then the next question is from Angelina Ilieva, who thanks you. I absolutely agree that struggles for improved access, I think that means improved access, affirms the value of the system of inequality in which we live. Could you discuss further the distinction you draw between the paradox of emancipation, where it seems to me you include quest to overcome racial inequality, for instance, and what you call the radical struggles directed at systemic forms of discrimination? I assume we'll agree that the struggle against racial inequality is addressing one systemic form of domination, systemic racism. Do you mean that addressing systemic racism only gets at one aspect of the system, namely limits to access, and therefore does not address the more fundamental problem of the system itself?
So the answer is yes. And in fact, watch out for the next issue of the journal Emancipations that I co-edit with my colleague James Chamberlain. There's a special issue on race and capitalism. Indeed, I believe in my talk, actually, I mentioned the increased competition for victimhood. So my understanding is that the competitive pressures of capitalism are generating more competition for ways of stabilization. And these claims to inclusion and equality are partly an answer. So, of course, we need to address inequalities of access, but unless we, of access to the system, but unless we eliminate those competitive pressures, capitalism would always find a way to create, these inequalities and the competition among groups for, the distribution of privileges.
The next question seems to actually be from a former student of yours from Brussels, Luc Gilday, who says he loves your work. My question is, why does the reactionary right seem to be more successful than the quote unquote reactionary left when it comes to easing the anxiety caused by precarity? That is, why do the people seem to be drifting towards more far right solutions to inequality, resource access, etc., than left solutions when they are both directly addressing the same issues in, radical ways, at least on the surface?
Yeah, perfect question. So I think that stability has always been, or traditionally been, in the ideological territory of the right. So the left wants revolutions, radical change, and people in precarious conditions are exactly scared of that. Much as they need that change, they're scared of change because precarity makes us conservative. That is why, this aversion to the left. And when I was counting votes for that study I mentioned 15 years ago, it was clear already back then that the left was losing the votes to the far right, exactly for those reasons. So unless the left reimagines a way to, to claim the agenda of stabilization as its own, it would continue losing the votes to the right.
I think I'm going to exploit my position to ask a question or two. So one of the things you write about is this drive for profit, the absolute nature of the drive for profit, almost as a kind of original sin, like the valuing of the drive for profit above all else. And I'd like to ask you to talk about that a little bit more. I mean, this is not exactly my field, but one of the things I've noticed is that you think, okay, capitalism, free market, drive for profit, that's what fuels creativity, that's what gives people an incentive to work, that's what creates, new fashion designers in Bulgaria that I then try to buy from on the internet, but they don't yet have a website. But then you look around and say, oh, we have for-profit prisons in America. Surely there's something pathologically wrong about that, because now you have a profit incentive to create more criminals. At what point did the drive for profit become pathological, or was it always pathological?
Look, I would not easily agree that the drive for profit is what drives human creativity. I would go there with Marx, with the famous description of the emancipated society as one where you can be, you can commit yourself to one thing in the morning. How was it? Fisherman? No, we can raise cattle in the morning and fish in the afternoon and be critical critics in the evening. So human beings are not productive beings, they're creative beings. So we would have the incentives, to create wealth, to create good things, to, this is innate to human beings. And actually, socialist societies in which I grew up, I mean, there was a lot of honor attributed to knowledge to creativity. So it is not the competition for profit that was driving these things. And of course, people do not produce sneakers or Mars bars out of the love of producing those things. But this kind of motivation for affluence, I believe it's not the only one. So it does more damage than good at this point. Of course, our approach to capitalism must be dialectical. We must admit, the good work it has done, for instance, in at least nominally inviting everybody to be part of this logic. So in principle, it is inclusive. Everybody who wants to play the game of profit production is welcome to join in. So it is more democratic system than the previous ones. But the very logic of especially the competitive production of profit is very nefarious.
Maybe I'll ask one follow-up since we're talking about dialectics. Listening to you talk, I kept thinking about Hegel's idea of when quantity becomes quality, when changes in scale become changes in kind. And it seems to me that a lot of what you're talking about implicitly has to do with scale. There's always going to be a certain amount of instability. There's always going to be a certain amount of drive for profit. There's always going to be a certain amount of inequality. But when does the change in scale become a change in kind?
I will attempt. I have not thought about that before. Thank you for this question. You know why I think we live in very special times? It is because even the winners in the distribution of advantage and disadvantage, hate their lives because they're precarious. So for me, your qualitative change is that in previous times, the class struggle, those who profited from the exploitation and from all this process, there were clear winners and clear losers. But now what my research shows and other people's have been writing about that. So even the winners, the rich and the well-employed, they hate their lives. So to put it brutally, maybe because also the affluent classes of the in liberal democracies, their education has led them to value a different kind of life with more leisure. And I quote those statistics in my book. People value more. We are not talking about even family work time balance. They're talking about leisure time, the value of leisure time, me time. So in order to be winners in the game, the price of winning has become so high that winning anymore, winning is not, it is not valued anymore in the way. So this for me is this kind of very peculiar historical moment we inhabit, that the rules of the game are changing in that sense. Yeah.
The next question speaks to that, from Andre Appel, that you mentioned that the security shortcuts that offer a relatively pain-free solution to those experiencing precarity. Could you talk more about how we convince people that are these shortcuts actually exacerbating the problem? I mean, how can we find some real stable ground to stand on, to alleviate this perpetual anxiety?
So let me see exactly what the question is. Security shortcut. Yeah. How to convince people that these shortcuts are actually perpetuating. I mean, this is our task as scholars, as public intellectuals, to talk about these things, and then also the political class, to make it responsible for creating stable livelihoods, stable sources of livelihood. Otherwise, you cannot convince people. If you have them worried about, their economic survival, they would not listen to arguments about, how they should not be afraid of immigrants. I think we need to start with socioeconomic reform before we become plausible even with arguments about saving the environment, being more tolerant culturally, etc. So first things first, and the first thing is this kind of economic stabilization, but only as an enabling condition. We cannot expect people to be generous and to think big and embrace wonderful change if they feel insecure. So what I'm arguing is not for economic stability as a value in itself, but as an enabling condition for other things.
Yeah, one of the things you spoke of was, sorry, there seems to be a fire alarm going off in my building. One of the things you spoke about was how you have people who feel responsible, like we're responsible for our children, and yet we're powerless. Whereas the governments who are supposed to be powerful and in fact don't seem to feel any responsibility for their populations. At what point did that shifted? Like the kind of grotesque irresponsibility that we see, which, we can have a president that gets up there and says, oh, there's a pandemic. Why don't you inject yourself with some Clorox?
Right. I trace one of the big shifts in this kind of power is when Western governments committed to a very peculiar policy priority they formulated as competitiveness in the global economy rather than competition. Because you do different things if you pursue competition and if you pursue competitiveness. If you pursue competitiveness, you create national champions. You prioritize those who already have an advantage in the global economy. And that, as you reduce the competition on specific actors, on handpicked, already powerful multinational companies, you increase the competition on everybody else. So that's one of the shifts. And that happened sometime around the turn of the century. Now, here's a specific example of how this played out. In 2017, the European Commission had proposed to Big Pharma to join forces and to start developing vaccines for virus of the corona family. This was done within a framework called Innovative Medicine Initiative, like a private-public company venture. Big Pharma, of course, said, no, thanks, it's not profitable. And the European Commission, which is a public body, said, okay, we're not going to do anything. So this kind of shift from the logic towards the logic of competitiveness that prioritize only stuff that would, make money, and that logic from, being enacted by a public authority rather than a company, private company. This is where the trouble is.
Do you have a sense?
Yeah.
Do you have a sense of where has there always been an insatiability for profit? Where you can have, again, this is a kind of quantity turning into quality, where you can just have grotesque amounts of money being accumulated by a small number of people, like the Sackler family, who just didn't seem to care that there was going to be an epidemic of deaths by opioid addiction, with this, this ceaseless drive for profit long past the point where you must have plenty of money. I mean, more money than you could ever spend in your lifetime.
look, I came across a very interesting survey while I was researching my book, a survey about American millionaires. And like about more than 80% said that they would rather quit money making in order to do other things. But they couldn't do it because they lived under a permanent fear of losing it all. So either because they're worried about their children or about the insecurity of their investments, that somehow this is all gonna vanish, and therefore they need or be not enough. So I don't know about the 0.1%, but very affluent people continue being in the rat race exactly out of this insecurity. And because public authority is not prepared to provide other forms of safety, look at the situation with the public healthcare in the US, but in Europe we have a better system, but the cuts. So we have better access, more equal access to a quality healthcare system, but the funding for the healthcare has been cut in over the past 2 decades. So the healthcare system cannot cope, hospitals cannot cope because of that.
We only have 1 minute left, but could you, because I know there are our students and young people in the audience, can you say something uplifting? Give us some hope to send them off. We're counting on this next generation to save the world.
Okay, I think that the good news is that finally we have a common enemy. And we don't have a precarious class, we have a precarious multitude. And so let's spread the word. We have a common enemy, and this is capitalism. And let's go and fight it.
Oh, thank you so much, Albena. It was lovely to see you. It would be still lovelier to see you in person, but hopefully at some point we will be doing that again. Take care. Have a great day. Thank you to our audience.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure. Excellent questions. Made me think even further. I was just tired of this topic, and questions like this may rekindle my interest.
Oh, thank you. Okay, Alexandra writes that was great. We especially have to inspire Alexandra because she is, still at the age where the world has not yet crushed her, and our hope is in that generation that has not yet been crushed. So, thank you.
And then, I think from talking to them, I sense that they're all ready to give up affluence for more better lives.
Yes.
Yeah. They have the right instinct.
Oh. Okay. All right, Christina, thank you as well for setting all this up. And everyone take care, stay safe, have a great day. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.